Great, great. Welcome, everybody, and we're so happy to have you here. On behalf of the Northern Virginia Local Arts Agencies, this is a workshop on evaluation for the arts and culture organizations. This is like part 2. We had one in May, and we figured we'd fill you in with part 2 and get our fingernails dirty on this one. My name is Cheryl Ann Colton. I'm a regional program director with the Office of the Arts in the city of Alexandria, Virginia. And my portfolio includes cultural resources. I am a senior lady who has a bob haircut, and I'm wearing a paisley blue turquoise kind of shirt, some silver jewelry. I'm going to just go over a few Zoom housekeeping things, and Rory, I know that you probably have some others. Before we get started, you can rename yourself and your organization if you prefer to. You can add your pronouns. Be sure to keep yourself muted during the course of the session. You can enter questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand to be unmuted. And when we pause for questions, we'll try to address them all. We will share the slide deck today and the video or the recording after today's presentation. Even though we're virtual today, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, something that we would prefer to do. Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax are located on the traditional land of the Algonquin and other indigenous peoples who are part of or allies of Powhatan chiefdom, past and present. So a little bit about the Local Arts Agencies of Virginia. It is a collaborative project initiative that we've been doing now for about 1.5 years. And it's with the Arlington County Cultural Affairs, the City of Alexandria's Office of the Arts, and Fairfax County's ArtsFairfax. The intention for this initiative is to expand resources and opportunities for artists and arts organizations throughout Northern Virginia area. And now I'm pleased to introduce our facilitator for the day, Rory Nooner, who will be leading the workshop. Rory is a seasoned learning and evaluation professional and an adjunct professional in program evaluation and monitoring at American University. She currently serves as a learning officer at the Boston-based Bar Foundation, where they support efforts in, and she supports efforts in gauging the foundation's impact and support of ongoing learning. Rory, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Cheryl, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our second workshop. And if you weren't at the first workshop, that's okay. We will take the opportunity today to give an overview of some of that content and the framework we were using to think about program evaluation in the context of arts and cultural organizations. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with some slides here. And I'd love a thumbs up from someone just to let us know that. Great, thank you. Okay, so evaluation for arts and culture organizations. Here we are. Let's get started by just talking a little bit about me. Cheryl Ann covered, I think, the real highlights, but I do evaluation for a living. I'm not sure if that makes me really boring or not, but I work for a foundation in Boston called the Bar Foundation. We do fund arts and cultural organizations across the state of Massachusetts. And so I have the privilege and luxury of working with our programmatic team that's doing some of that work a bit north of where most of you are, I imagine. And as Cheryl Ann mentioned, closer to all of you, I do work with American University and the graduate students working on monitoring and evaluation work. All right, so today's agenda, what we're going to cover, we're in the introduction portion right now. On the left there, we'll do a little bit of community building to have folks talk to one another. As I mentioned previously, we'll do a quick refresher on the first workshop. And then we're going to really dig into logic models and talk about like what they are, why they exist, hopefully why they're not as terrible as you might think, and how they can be really helpful for charting a path to a more impactful program that you're working on. And then we'll talk also about like how to actually take logic models and work in collaboration with other people to put them together. And I'll give you a real life example of a project that I worked on. And We'll then talk a little bit today about data collection and measurement. So like, how do you actually know that you're making progress toward your outcomes? And last but not least, we'll then wrap things up. And you see in the bottom right corner there, again, this is the second workshop. If you want to go back, there's, as Cheryl mentioned, recording in the slides from the first workshop that we held a couple weeks ago in May. Can't believe it is already June. All right. So just a couple norms for today. I like to use these whenever we're talking about program evaluation. You know, to the extent you can be present, that'd be lovely. We are going to actually ask you to dig in today. We'll put you in a breakout groups and do some things. You know, it's up to you whether or not you want to come on video, etc. But we'd love you to engage in those to the extent that you're available to do so. I think whenever you're doing this kind of work in program evaluation, it's really helpful to just be curious and open-minded about the work that you do. So I think the best kind of orientation toward this is to really think about your own work and others' work with like, there might be new ways to see it and think about it. And then last but not least, you know, being creative about different ways to measure things, creative about what your ultimate impact is going to be, will be helpful as well. All right, so we've got about 11 participants, and why don't we just do a quick round of introductions? We already had myself, and we heard from Cheryl Ann. Why don't we throw people into, into breakout rooms real quick, just to do some quick introductions of like, hi, my name is, I work for this organization, just like 4 minutes of round robin introductions.
Sure.
All right. Well, hopefully it was a good chance, like I said, to get to know someone and someone to be talking to a bit more today. All right, so let's recap the first workshop a bit for those of you who weren't there. And for those of you that were, you know, hang in here for just a couple minutes. This will be quick, but we wanted to enter program evaluation from more of a storytelling frame to make it a little bit more accessible to people. And I think these frames are useful for everyone, whether or not you're a very seasoned person with regard to program evaluation, or it's brand new to you and it may be feeling intimidating. So one way I think we can think about our work in arts and cultural organizations, or really in any kind of like social impact nonprofit setting. And I'd say, as you're thinking about your arts and culture organization, the frame for today, as you're thinking about it, is pick one program. So not the full body of work your organization necessarily does, but like one aspect of it. So, you know, if I'm an arts organization that has a youth programming piece, and like I'd pick that programming piece, not, you know, some of my others. So pick one program for the purposes of today. And the frame from the last workshop was to think about that program as if it were a movie. And so we talked a little bit about parsing the different pieces of a movie. So you have like the main characters in the movie, and you have the settings in which you're sort of imagining those main characters moving through the plot line and the story of the movie. We talked about like the context in which they're working. So in my youth arts education program, my main characters would probably be the kids that are receiving that programming. I would also have characters like the people who are delivering said programming, but you know, the kids are probably the main characters. And then again, to use the storytelling frame, thinking about like where we're going in the story and in the movie. So we picked up at a later date in the thinking about those kids, like what are they experiencing as they're moving through, let's say, this arts education program? Like they go to workshops, and what happens in the workshops? Like, what do you envision them? We had some I think really lovely conversations too about thinking about translating this work from this. I think logic models and program evaluation can often like sound really dry and boring, but like thinking about that of like, I'm imagining the kids' faces lighting up when they're engaging in making art, for example. So translating both like the literal, like what they're doing, and also kind of like what changes we're seeing, and starting to also make that a bit more compelling and tapping into an emotional side of that. So what they're experiencing. No one wants to watch a movie where there's like no emotions, right? Like there's no There's no excitement, there's no enthusiasm, there's no conflict. We like stories because they're appealing in those ways. And so thinking about your own work and what drives you to do this work through both of those lenses. And then the like happily ever after of like what happens to the main characters that are going through your program. So in the context of the arts education program, we had conversations about first one program, a person who had been involved was talking about, like they go into this program and they have better educational outcomes. So like, what is the sort of happily ever after, and what is that ultimate impact we're really driving toward? So that was the frame of the first session. And again, the elements of any story, I already discussed this a bit, but you have main characters. You might also have other characters involved, as I said earlier, but parsing them in that way and being really clear about who are those, what the main actions of the story are, so like the key points in which your program is delivering services. And then how do we know what happened? Like what happened in the movie? Like, again, what are those things that you're seeing? And how that's actually impacting your characters over the longer term. We also talked about this in terms of the framework of simplifying, right? So I work in a philanthropic setting. I read a lot of grant applications and work with a lot of nonprofit organizations as they're pitching us ideas for things to fund. We see, I think, some ideas or you've probably all seen a movie like this where it's like, you cannot keep track of all of the different things that are happening. And so also thinking about like parsing so that it's clear. So as a funder, I'll say, the more compelling, often at least programmatic proposals are delivering like a certain number of things and have a certain clear set of main characters, but don't have like so many plot points that we like as a funder can't try to sort of figure out like, where are you trying to go? So we definitely do see that. And this is that movie analogy again of like, that moment where you're like, you turn to the person you're watching the movie with, like, what is happening? It's similar to sort of like wanting to parse your own program. All right, so we talked a little bit about the storytelling frame from the last time. And then today we're gonna get into this in terms of the very nuts and bolts basics of a logic model. If folks could kind of open up the chat real quick, how familiar, since we have a lot of new folks today, if any of the new folks or the folks who attended the first workshop as well, why don't you just share in the chat, like on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being never heard of a logic model before and 5 being incredibly familiar, how familiar are folks with logic models? So maybe jump in the chat and share. Okay, there, Hope's right in the middle. We'll give folks a second. 10. I love it. Isha should be teaching today. Joan's a 2. Great. Okay. All right, we got a 4, a 3. Okay, so people are all over they're different kinds, so I think I consider it, but not making charts. Okay. All right. So it sounds like we have folks are familiar with what my take from this. Folks are familiar with what a logic model is. We got a few people who feel very expert in this. Feel free to raise your hand to add your own advice, your own wisdom into the chat today. We'd love to make this interactive. So feel free to jump in, but no one's never heard of a logic model before. So I will use that to kind of guide our conversation. So logic models really are a way to tell your organization's story, or the story of a programmatic element. Included here, a logic model from the National Endowment for the Arts. We showcased this last time, but I think this is an example of a highly stylized, designed logic model. We're going to talk about lots of different kinds of logic models today. This is a really, like nice looking one. They are, I will say though, like they can look different ways. So this one has arrows that point in kind of different directions. They're talking about different kinds of levels of outcomes. So one is at systems change level, one's at a local community change. And then there's like the classic version, right? Like the just like very linear chart version. We sent out a sample document for today that is in a Google Doc, and I can share that link in the chat of just the linear model. We can talk about like the linearity of all of this in a second, but we're going to kind of work from the basic version today, and we can talk later on. I can show you in my example, I'll showcase like how these can kind of get logic models can be nested. There can be multiple arrows moving in different directions, reflecting the complexity of your program, or they can be really simple. Depends on kind of what you're trying to accomplish. But I guess to make the point, think about them as, we're going to start with this linear example, but you can think about them as being flexible. Don't take this in a super rigid way. So the main elements of a logic model are showcased here. Again, in terms of this point I just made about the concreteness or rigidity of logic models, and particularly when it comes to like the outcomes section, there's a lot of different debates and a lot of different ways people do outcomes. And again, it depends on the kind of program you're trying to deliver. We're going to get into that today too. Okay, so why the heck do we want to do logic models? Often the answer folks give is because my funder's making me do it. Yes, that's true. Oftentimes there are a number of funders that do require logic models as part of a grant funding application, but I think there are lots of other ways in which logic models can be really valuable. So a couple things. As a program evaluation person, I'm a big advocate that logic models can be done collaboratively, which helps organizations and people working on a shared goal also develop a common vocabulary. So like we all know what our North Star is. We all know what we're trying to accomplish. We know what's going to be required to accomplish that. And that kind of having the whole team pointed in the same direction can be really helpful. Again, as the point I just made, I think logic models can be a really collaborative learning opportunity. I'm going to showcase an example of that. It focuses on outcomes. It makes visible like what works and why. And it, as we'll talk about today too a bit, can help you clarify like how are we going to know? So how are we going to measure what it is we're trying to accomplish? And then I think, you know, funders use it for reporting reasons. Okay, so I'm going to run through a real quick real life example. This is not, unfortunately, an arts example, but I still think I hope it's compelling. This is a nonprofit organization that I worked with. It's in Flint, Michigan. What their job is all around fresh food. And I'm just going to run quickly through a logic model process that they went through. So Flint Fresh has this mobile market. You see here this truck. They were really, this is several years old now, but they were really proud. It's pre-pandemic, really proud of this truck. They got a grant to expand the delivery that they're doing and help ensure access to fresh food for residents. In the grant, they said, okay, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to expand the capacity of this mobile market, the bus you just saw. We're going to increase our staffing. We need to do that to be able to expand that. And we're going to also launch in addition to like a market you can walk up to and buy things off the bus. We're going to also deliver vegetable boxes to people. So they needed help really trying to figure out like, okay, we got this grant. How are we going to like put all the pieces together to make this happen over the life of the grant? And this was a big grant for their organization, and they were trying to make sure they were all in alignment. So some of you might create logic models before you apply for the grant. That is a good way to do it, but they decided to create this after they'd gotten the grant in order to actually like help them make sure they had all the pieces. And so again, kind of here are the pieces of this. We covered this in a previous slide. You know, here's another kind of linear example of a logic model. All right, so one of the things we did with the Flint Fresh folks is we actually started at the end. We got everybody together in a room at a YMCA, and you're seeing actual pictures here. We put up Like we got the big Post-it notes. It's amazing that the variety of Post-it notes they sell these days. We put everyone who's been working on this project in a room together. We bought some food for lunch and we said, okay, we're going to start with the end in mind. So what is it that this work writ large is trying to accomplish? So those were the programmatic impacts. These are like the intended change Flint Fresh folks wanted to see in the community. In the Google Doc that Hope linked in the chat, we didn't put impacts in. We were trying to scale this down for you, but I wanted to start with this just to kind of showcase like your program that you're thinking about today is probably tied to like some bigger picture. Like I'm trying to change the world to do and look like this, and that's usually your impact. 5 years, 10 years, maybe 25 years, etc. We started there. You see some examples on the slide. We worked backward from that on some of the outcomes. So these are like the things that we talked about earlier of like what's happening to your main characters. There's more specific changes in this program of things that were taking place. So for the food truck as an example, the bus, you see here in this corner, like increasing their revenue. So they had this grant funding, but they knew over the life of the grant funding that they really needed to be selling vegetables and selling their produce in a way that was actually generating revenue so that they'd be sustainable over the long term. So that was one of the outcomes they were aiming toward over the life of the grant. So you have your big impact and you can think about some of your outcomes. Working backwards a bit, and we're going to go over these again. This is the outputs are the things that like I think sometimes can be a little bit easier. They're typically things we can count. They're things that the activities we do in our programs produce or create. The arts education example I've been kind of weaving in here for youth, outputs might be that like over the course of a year, 200 kids attended our workshops. So outputs are things we can sort of say, okay, we can count that. The outcomes would have been more oriented toward what actually happened to those kids through the arts education. So they gained skills, they changed their behavior, they are more prepared for some other educational opportunity. They're more likely to pursue a career in the arts. Those are sort of the difference between the outputs and the outcomes. And then I'm working backward through the logic model here. So forgive me, it's at least in America, and as for English speakers, usually that we go left to right. We read that way. It's kind of how we move through things. But activities, pretty straightforward in terms of thinking about these are the things we actually do as part of our program. And then inputs. So inputs are like the material and immaterial, tangible things, all the different things that you need to be able to actually deliver your program. So it can be grants that you need to actually fund the work. It can be volunteers. It can be, you need things like you see on this slide, like a website or a phone application. Now, a website could be an input. A website might also be an outcome of a project. So maybe you're actually building. So we can parse some of that later, but things and resources you need to input into the work to get to your ultimate goal. All right, and I covered some of this earlier, but when we kind of start to put all the logic model together, we start to think about like how particularly the outputs, outcomes, and impacts fall together. The outputs are usually more short-term, again, like things you can measure right away. Outcomes tend to be short-term, but to more intermediate term. All right, so one of the things that we want to do today is actually have you try to dig in together to talk about some of this. And Hope had put the link to the Google Doc here. So a couple of you submitted a version of this ahead of time, which is great. So thank you to those of you who did. You have a good start. Hopefully you have that in hand. But for the rest of you, what we'd love to have you do is in a breakout group, why don't we spend about 15 minutes, both like brainstorming out loud, but then also working in the document to think about specifically what is the end in mind? So where are you trying to go with your program? So in your small groups, talking to each other, you're going to want to share a little bit about the program that you're actually going to use as today's example. Or again, one program, not everything your organization is doing. And then like, what is the intended, like, what's the happily ever after of that program? We're implementing this because, and then also sharing a bit about, if you back away from happily ever after, what are some of the nearer term things you want to accomplish? So let's spend 15 minutes doing that. Hope, can you help us out with the breakout rooms again? Thanks, Hope. How'd that go? How is anyone brave to share with the full group about, your thoughts about starting from working backwards and starting from and thinking about the difference between outcomes and impacts? What came up for you?
Well, I can talk about HERD. We have established outcomes based on, the work we did with our strategic planner. So they're very codified. They're very literal. They're very, 1 to 5, these statements. But impact is when we ask also the people that we serve, when we ask them to write comments. And that's where we get our impact. And, we get things like, you changed my life. And, I never knew that I had a voice. I never knew I was a writer. I look forward, this is the only thing I look forward to while I'm incarcerated, that kind of thing. To me, those are impacts.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks for being courageous and sharing with the whole group. And that's lovely. I will make a couple comments about that, but does anyone else want to share first? Great. So in the first workshop, we talked a little bit about, we used the storytelling framework also to talk a little bit about the power of narratives and how we're living in a very complex world with a lot of information, and it's very crowded, and that stories like that, Jane, I think of like the ways in which things really impacted people's lives like in an incredibly meaningful way, and they're getting to tell their story through your program is really like part of also like cutting through all the clutter to really tell your program story. And so I think kind of combining, the evaluation world, we talk a lot about like qualitative versus quantitative data, and telling like pairing like the numbers, the quantitative data of your story with like those personal stories, the qualitative of like, this is how these two things fit together. I think not only is more compelling, but even, evidence shows, and we talked about this again in the first workshop, like that's what helps people actually remember and like feel the impact of what you're talking about. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, so keep moving along here. Oops, excuse me.
Can I?
Please, Dean. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was encouraged to say something by my breakout work colleagues, and it goes to the point that Jane just made too about how to figure out ways to get a sense of the outcomes and the impact when you can't do a digital survey. We, in our larger shows where we have several hundred people in an auditorium, we always do a digital survey. And in one of our youth programs, we had about 100 youth show up, and so we asked them to do a digital survey at the end. But a lot of the community engagement with veterans and at nursing homes and assisted living facilities and places like that we go, we don't have the opportunity to do that. So, and even the idea of asking a nursing home or assisted living folks to say, well, would you write down your comments? I don't even think I can do that. I mean, I could, in the aftermath of singing for them, I suppose we could go around the room and just ask them individually how did they feel about it, and would you like us to come back sometime, and then record some of that stuff, I suppose, or just write it down after the fact as an anecdotal reaction And we can take pictures of smiling people while they're singing to us, but it's often difficult to sort of explain to a funder then the kind of impact that we've had. So one of the things I mentioned is that if the activities manager at one of these facilities is likes what we do and they remember us and they ask us to come back year after year or something like that, that would be a really good outcome, because so often I'm proactive in trying to find these opportunities for our course. But when people become aware of us through having attended one of these things, then they say, well, I remember the harmonizers are really welcoming to the opportunities to come and sing for us. And so I'm going to call them up and see if they'll come, at Christmas time or something like that. So anyway, but Jane's comment about getting comments, that was very helpful for me. Thank you.
And that's tough because, Dean, I bet you can relate to this. If we have like a very emotional event, because sharing is always a part of our program, if you want to, right? Nobody has to share or should be made feel to share, but a lot of people want to share, especially if it's a poem or an artwork or something like that. So as the class is ending, there may be a lot of emotion, there may be tears, there may be hugging. And then you don't want to say, okay, we have 3 minutes left, here's a piece of paper. I mean, it just kind of destroys the whole mood. And we've struggled with that as well. Dean and Kara and some of the others, how you've gotten around that, because you want to leave them with that, vulnerable, positive feeling, not write something down for us so we can get more money.
Yeah, I suppose if we systematically asked our members who participate to write down their own experiences, like within 24 hours or so of the and little stories that they may have had about the interaction that they had with the people who were there, that might help too. But we don't do that. We don't collect that as a systematic way right now. So.
I want to be I want to thank you both for sharing and be really cognizant of the part of this that, Jane, to your point, I think of what I was hearing you say of like, you don't want this to be like extractive and transactional, because you're creating these experiences that don't feel like that. And that's part of why they're powerful. And so, yeah, how to balance that. I think a couple things that I'll say is, I'm hearing this even both Dean and Jane you're sharing, is being mindful that these stories are out there, and are there ways to intentionally create, be at thinking ahead by knowing that these are some of your these are the impacts of your program, of saying like, okay, we are gonna ask people for permission. We know we want to collect a few of these stories. And giving people full, opportunity to say no. So not collecting it in a way that they don't know that you've collected it. But there's also some evaluation techniques. There's things like, this name's a little bit horrible, but outcome harvesting, where like you get people together and you actually say like, oh, we're going to buy you lunch and have a conversation. And the point of this really is for us to both hear it, but also for us to collect this, because we do need to tell the story to, our funders and our donors, and to keep this thing that we know has been so moving to you, and let them really opt into that as a specific opportunity to share those. But again, I think if you don't know that that's where you're trying to drive, then you're not going to be able to be intentional about collecting that in a way that's gonna like honor them and not be extractive. But it is tough. It certainly is tough to do that. And I think we've also all probably been part of moments where it felt like the story was getting told in a little bit of an inauthentic way, and felt a little bit like, I think as a funder, sometimes it feels like, okay, wanting to really honor everyone's involvement in everyone's story. So thank you both for sharing. Kara, do you want to say anything more about the SurveyMonkey comment you made? I'm just contextually wanting to make sure I'm understanding that comment.
Yeah, I was following up on the thoughts of Jane and Dean, where, we do a lot of work where people listen to us and enjoy us, and we want to leave them with that. And I'm wondering if maybe, in our case, at least with a lot of our like tickets, which by the way, we do a pay what you can model. We have concerts this weekend, shameless plug. AlexandriaSingers.com. We do collect people's emails, you know, like people voluntarily do that. And I'm wondering if maybe we can send after the concert, like an email that says like, hey, what did you get out of our concert? You know, so that way they've had time to sort of sit with it and it doesn't feel as transactional, was just sort of my thought. And so I said a Survey Monkey just because, or a Google form or what have you, even just an email being like, email us back a blurb of what you thought about it or something like that could maybe be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great short-term like outcome measurement strategy to get some feedback and perhaps get some qualitative information from folks about what they did experience. That's a great idea. Any other comments or thoughts? This has been some really fantastic sharing here about some of the outcomes and impacts of your work and like how to also then think about actually capturing that. So I want to just pause for a second here. In the business I'm in, you really get going on thinking about outcomes. And I think these slides are just like really helpful. I mean, this is almost like outcomes as Mad Libs. That's a little bit of perhaps a dated reference, but you know, I am as old as I am. But, you know, just like thinking about crafting actually quality outcomes as you're trying to, whether you're putting this together for a funder or you're thinking as a group about like making sure you're really capturing the full breadth of the work you're trying to achieve. So this is from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I've just always found this like a really helpful guide to think about like, oh, like what is it I'm trying to say that we're doing? And I do some of this in my own work. So like what changes, who changes, and additional specifics. You see here some examples that we've used. You know, I think examples are always really helpful of outcomes of like what it is we're trying to put together and like pithy statements for funders, because oftentimes, you know, like especially now with most of the applications being, you know, online, which is great. There can be like a word count limit. It's like, how do I say this super impactful thing in 250 characters? I think sometimes this kind of checklist or this formula can be helpful as well. So here's just some examples, and these will be in the slides that I know Hope will send out afterwards as well. And then I think, again, you were all doing this, I think, a bit in the group, and I'm encouraging you, but this is that kind of like working backwards or different directions you can be working in and thinking about then how your outcomes, both primary and intermediate, connect to your actual outputs. So to put Kara's example, the singers group is having these events this weekend. Outputs might just be like, how many people attended? How many people did we reach with our messaging about the event? Whereas the intermediate outcomes might be something they're capturing in that 48-hour survey, or I'm sorry, primary outcomes. It might be, you know, they're capturing that and then like some longer term outcomes. Connected then to some of the impact, which might be your strategic goals as an organization. All right, so I hope folks are having a chance in the small groups to talk a little bit and fill in your actual worksheet a bit. And now we're going to kind of shift from like that big happily ever after, some of you were doing some of this in our conversation, which was lovely, but for a few minutes, what I want to do is kind of get into the nuts and bolts, and we're actually moving now from like big picture vision, where we're all trying to go, the ways in which we're trying to change the world, to like the nitty gritty of how we're actually going to measure some of the stuff we're doing. And like what, I mean, in some ways, this is like, what is some of the stuff we can count to have some idea of our output? So what I'd love you to do is just jump back into your breakout rooms and think together just for a couple minutes. This is gonna be a shorter breakout about what are some of the outputs you have now from your program. So again, if it's a youth education program, what are sort of some of the tangible things that you know you're going to produce as a result of putting your program together? You can be filling that in your document. Maybe you have a piece of paper you're drawing some of this out on, but then also sharing that with your same breakout group. So Hope, I'm sure you've already gotten my cue about the breakout groups again, but if you could help me send everyone off back into the ether for a few minutes to talk to each other, then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about measurement. Any thoughts about thinking about outputs? Anyone want to share any high level takeaways from your breakout?
I would say people involvement, getting people into at least the organization and getting them to believe in the mission and getting them engaged. That's one tangible way that I can see that it's working.
Yeah, and so as you're thinking about how you measure your outputs, it's probably going to also help you illuminate some of your activities and inputs. So a couple the logic models that were submitted ahead of time, and I see this a lot in this work, is I think people think of like they think of their activities mainly through the lens of like what's being delivered to the main characters. And sometimes you start to think about outputs. You're also able to start thinking about like all the other work that it takes to make that thing happen. So in the case of Kara's ALX Singers group, you know, there's all these promotion activities that also have to happen to actually get people to the event. So thinking about the rest of your logic model of like, you need both those inputs and those activities. The activity is not just the sort of main event, but all those other pieces. Any other questions or things that came up related to outputs? Another point I'll just make is, you know, I know oftentimes in these are also things in the arts world that you have to have some infrastructure to actually be able to collect. So like remembering ahead of time, like we actually have to know how many people showed up. We have to have somebody that actually does that. So by laying out what your actual outputs that you do want to be collecting, it will also help you figure out like how you're actually going to put the infrastructure together to collect those. I also like to think of outputs oftentimes as like just quick indicators of like how you're doing, like are things headed generally in the right direction? You know, so how many people are showing up to like a workshop or an event does give you a sign of like, there are people in the room, it's going well, but doesn't tell you necessarily about the quality of the event, but it is important to part of telling your story. Okay, next we're gonna move, this is gonna be the last part of today. Well, actually sort of the second to last piece. I just want to talk a little bit about measurement. So I alluded to this when I was just talking about outputs that we do as we're laying out our logic model, as we're laying out those outputs and outcomes, then I like to, with the group that's putting together the logic model, actually think about like, how are we going to measure these things? So like I was just talking about with counting audience members or, you know, thinking about like number of website hits, but like actually parsing through the list of outcomes and outputs that you put together as a group, in order to say like, we're going to be able to collect this through a survey, or we're going to count the people in the room, or we're going to, you know, interview people once a year. We're going to put together a series of interviews just to hear about like to have them tell their story. But I do want to say a couple things. There's I think a lot of times in organizations, a compulsion, like even in surveys, to like pack surveys with so many questions. So one of the things that we like to tell folks, I think in the evaluation world, is like really start with like what you absolutely need. And one of the things you can do is just sit down with a piece of paper and think about like, what is it you actually want to report out on? Like what, if you were going to show a funder, you know, the measures that we're showing success of your program, like what would you put on that piece of paper? In the evaluation world, we often call this like a data placemat. That's a topic for a whole other webinar, but like, what are the things that like are the key stories you want to be able to tell, and backing up from there? I think often with surveys, you know, like, why are you collecting that piece of information? Are you actually going to use that? And is anyone asking you for that? I know that funders often require certain kinds of measures from the grant funding that they give. And so you might also start there too. Like what's the list of all the things we're being asked to collect? How do those actually map on to our outputs and outcomes? And starting there so you can start to catalog things. The Flint Fresh program was that I showcased a bit earlier, was one of the projects that I've worked on in the past that showcased an issue that I've also seen in terms of not reinventing the wheel. So when I was doing evaluation consulting work before joining a foundation and doing philanthropic evaluation work, I worked on a project where a number of food organizations like Flint Fresh wanted to engage in some shared measurement work, and found myself in a situation where you had like 8 or 9 different organizations that were all asking survey questions about relatively the same thing, but they were all asking it in slightly different ways, which meant that like there was no way to actually roll up any of the information being collected. So when I say don't reinvent the wheel, I'm talking about like, are there opportunities for any kind of shared measurement strategies? Before we got started in the webinar today, and I know there's some, this isn't necessarily accessible for very small arts organizations, but Americans for the Arts, SMU Data Arts, some of those organizations out there have like, they're keeping certain kinds of measures you might look to. I think there's often for smaller organizations also like just asking other similar organizations, what's the information you collect and like, how do you ask the question so that folks are collecting things in the same way. Foundations, I will say, funders also, we are working on, and we need to get our act together because sometimes we're like asking organizations for like basically the same thing. You know, we can't solve all these problems overnight, but I think not reinventing the wheel with like what you're collecting in terms of data is the way to go. Okay, so I just want to showcase a couple of last things and we'll go to questions and kind of wrap up. And this is going back to the Flint Fresh example. And I want to talk a little bit about like the arc again of like logic model development and creation. So I talked about this earlier as a collaborative process. We did this logic model workshop with the Flint Fresh folks. This is a relatively complex example, but this is like the actual raw output from that brainstorming session. What I want to show you here is that like logic model exercise can be collaborative and it doesn't need to be like chiseled in stone overnight. So we put this all together. We actually just put it into PowerPoint because that's a very accessible and easy to use program that most people have access to, and put these into their categories. So you see here, you know, the impacts at the end and the inputs on the left, and then we realized we had a second session. We gave folks the work and said, did we get it right? So there were a couple of weeks in between these. And what we realized is we actually need to recategorize some things. We also started to draw some arrows to connect things and then actually create kind of like channels of activity. This is a complex logic model. So really this could probably be like 4 different smaller, more parsed out logic models. I think you can start to see here kind of the evolution of both like some of the things we thought were, for example, in this here, some of the things we thought were outputs were actually activities. Some of the things we thought were outcomes, we realized were actually outputs. Here we have an input that ended up being an output. But this was part of the group sense making process to be able to say, okay, the work fits together in these ways. So this was the second session where we took that raw output and started to make it into more of a coherent whole. And then this is not necessary, but then the group actually did have some funding to put together like a graphically designed version. And this was the 1-pager that really stripped everything down. And this became the document that the group was able to use with funders, sort of say like, this is where we're trying to go. These are all the different pieces we have. And this was the result of those 2 workshops and some facilitation help to do that. I will also say here, you see in their case, they ended up with a vision instead of just an impact. The outputs, impacts, vision piece, that's up to you and your organization as long as you're clear about like what that means for you. That can be all very flexible. but you kind of can see the parsed evolution here. So that's really a overview of the nuts and bolts of logic models. And I want to pause to see if folks have questions, comments, additional thoughts, since we had some folks who said they were logic model experts. What else before we wrap up here today do people want to talk about and share?